So, welcome everybody. I think we are live streaming now. Welcome to Earthwalkways. And, this podcast is really about life as a soul journey or an earthwalk. And some of the many ancient and contemporary maps and tools that we have available to help us navigate it. And the ones that I've found that I have worked well for me. But there is a lot out there, and so just the seeking is well worth it, and the finding is important. So I would hope that we can explore a little deeper into the reasons why sometimes we struggle in finding the answers, and we are deeply seeking. And I think it has to do with this time that we're in on the medicine wheel. So, as the medicine wheel of the year rolls towards fall, and we say goodbye to the direction of the south, and we enter into the lodge of the southwest. And this is the lodge of the mediums and singers. And the saying for this lodge is to know your history, to prophesy the future. So, in older traditions, there were often singers who knew the stories, sang the songs, kept the history of the community alive and the teachings of the community and the experiences. And so these were important, you know, uh, technologies and services to the community to learn the songs and remember the songs and sing them in the ceremonial times. And so then those are the singers, and then the mediums, which are also in this lodge, they're tuning into the signs of the present time and listening deep within, to guidance. And it's kind of like by knowing the past and being fully in the present and seeking listening, it was in this way that the choices and the decisions were made for the future. And so choices are made, and the council could consider this moment in relationship then to the past and this present, and then ultimately into the future. So the first time around this medicine wheel that I'm working with, and let me see if I can share a picture. It's called the Path of Inquiry. And so it's got actually this is divided into also other ones. So like I said, we're in the Southwest, and so there's this way that we're in this singers and storytellers, mediums and healers lodge, right? And so see if I can bring it up. And so the inquiry that we have in this lodge is, what would the story be? What do you prophesy? What would it mean? And who would you be now if you knew? So in a way, it's sort of also sensing into the impulses that you have of who you are within your intuition, your deep internal knowing of your own becoming, right? So this is a wheel in a way of being and becoming, and at a certain level we're in this depth of being, but that being is learning itself and moving through these places and becoming more and more of itself. And so just to say a little bit about the overall lodge. So you have the children's spire in the center, and in actuality, like when this is a lodge that is a developmental wheel, there's an interesting way that they talk about that we spend uh, 3 times 9 months, or excuse me, 4 times 9 months in each of the lodges. And so 4 is the Earth number, and 9 is the number of months of gestation to be born. And so, like, that kind of completes a round in each. So, when you're born in the children's fire in the center of the wheel, and you spend from birth to basically 3 years old, because 4 times 9 months is 3 years. And so then you also go out into the men's lodge, um, and this is, where this, questioning begins. What's wrong? What about me? What about us? It's kind of the mind and the discernment and the discriminating, and what about them and what about God, right? And so it's knowledge and the known, looking out, and trying to understand the world that we're in, as well as how we can relate into it. And then in the southeast, there's you go into another lodge called the Peace Chiefs Lodge, which the inquiry there is, how can I keep the peace? And it's interesting because these lodges are like a dance in and out. I guess I can't point to it very well. I don't know if you can see the pointer, but you go into the center and out to the outer, looking out, and then you go back into the center and then back out. And so it's a kind of weaving back and forth from individuation and connection, right? Being separate and being together. And it's a dance of balance, and it's a dance of these lodges and inquiries. And then if you apply this, that it takes 3 times 9 moons for each of these 9 lodges, it takes 27 years to go around the wheel one whole time, experiencing each of these perspectives and each of these questions and each of these parts of our experience. And then when we have gone around once, we're considered to be human now. That without the perspective of the whole wheel, we're not fully human. And then it takes like 3 times around, and oftentimes revisiting these places in the lodge, especially where we might have gotten stuck in the first time, that creates wisdom. And so 3 times around, you're 81. So this used to help me relax. I'm getting closer to 81 now. But when I was younger, I used to think, oh, I don't have to be wise. I can relax and just be me and let life take me into wisdom. And in some ways, I feel like, I'm closer than before, for sure. Uh, so let me go back, and it's kind of a way that where we are now, in this time of the year, and I think also in kind of our human experience. We are in this mediums and singers lodge, and it's a kind of the first time around. We're like in early adolescence. We go into this lodge from 12 to 15. And so it's a time when childhood is transitioning into youth, and the course of one's future and the place in the community is, beginning to be explored, determined, like defined. Oftentimes the child will have a new name that is chosen or found at this time, that, now that the child has been in the world and demonstrated its character and its qualities more, it can rename and be in its essence in that way, and have that essence acknowledged by the community in that way. And so there's this way in which uh, a lot of times this name and this place in the community is actually determined through initiation rites. And the initiation rites themselves are a process of self-discovery, which I think is really necessary for youth. In a way, it's part of their journey at this time, and that was sort of the natural system that was developed by tribal peoples. And then in our world, we're not as grounded or understanding of this deep inner process that is happening within our own development and the development of our children. And so, this is a way that in the time of deep exploration, the person, like in the early stages of this, it's like they're like the thespian at the Oasis, who am I, and they try on roles and experiences to, is this, I like this, is this, who I want to be, is this, how can I express my own unique genius and then bring my gift to the community? Who am I really? What is my essence or my nature? But in the beginning, to find that, we all have to become sort of actors or little thespians, kind of exploring different roles. And then right at the point where we begin to sort of gel and see, sense, maybe that something about ourselves. And of course, in toxic situations, oftentimes that's very difficult because we have taken in, bad information about who we are, and we also don't have this, depth of connection with our inner essence that is, helpfully cultivated in healthy communities. And so, when we encounter this, time, we really do need to have elder support or a system, a way of, moving into these questions and then deepening into, our authenticity. Who are we really? What is rightfully yours? How can you express it in your own unique genius and bring your unique gift to your community? And who do you want to become in the world is the question. And of course, during this time, like I said, one often explores the roles and specialties that you might admire. You try on roles and ways of expressing yourself. Uh, Bill Plutkin calls this first encounter with this lodge in a soul-centric developmental process as the thespian at the Oasis, right? And so it's a healthy time to explore masks in a way, but we don't want to like think that the mask is who we are, or that we can live completely through a mask. There are even times when maybe you wear a little mask in the grocery store when somebody says, how are you doing? And you say, I'm fine, or something like that. So, depends on the depths of intimacy with others, but the authenticity is so important. And so when we get kind of trapped at this level of development, where we're just trying to see who's going to give us the most applause for a certain role and that kind of thing, then we're not growing, we're not evolving, we're staying in this early stage of adolescence and kind of being stuck there. But it is a place where we want to try to drink of all the possibilities and try them on for size. Is this me, or do I want to be like this? The end of this process is supposed to lead us into the depths of our interior. So as we begin to ask these questions, we're supposed to go deeper and face more and more of, our experience and who we are. Um, and so what we're doing is like descending, where we encounter deeper layers of our consciousness or unconsciousness in the shadow, but as well the higher self, the inner essence, right? And so in our culture, we don't have a process that allows a descent like this. And it's why even grown-ups and leaders of our culture seem very mature, sort of like school-ground bullies. And in our culture, the process of initiation into adulthood is sort of watered down, into graduation ceremonies, maybe religious confirmations. In some areas, it's the gangs, maybe military service, but it's very unhealthy for the most part, limiting, and so I find that this is one of the ancient understandings that it would be very helpful for us to reconnect with. So, and for all of us, even, like there's different stages of initiation, so there's a first initiation there, but we can sometimes not have that initiation, and so we take it much later in life, or we, may do many initiations as we learn to kind of incorporate them into our journey of transformation. So, this initiation should apply, both to men and women, and both men and women carry wounds and ancestral trauma and clan patterns. And the pathwork guide says, we're integrating, both our father and our mother's lineage, right? So, that there's a lot that the soul is bringing forth and working on and trying to integrate and harmonize. And so, if we can understand and accept all of life as a kind of personal responsibility, it actually makes lighter the life. When we don't understand that it's a soul journey that we're on, instead of like how in the ego story, it's like we're supposed to just, get the job, get the gal, get the money, be fulfilled. This is an ego fulfillment journey, and it you know seems to be not all that useful. Many people even that achieve it, I don't know that they're actually deeply fulfilled, and many people that struggle thinking that they're supposed to fulfill it, suffer a lot when they could be discovering their own actual real fulfillment. And so, again, in order to do this, we have to understand that life is actually about a descent to soul. Our soul is not, the ascent in meditation or the, going into the light. It's like there is light within the descent, but it's not an ascent into specialness, but it is where we can discover our own very beautiful and unique life. And from there, we can add to the world our own wisdom, and our soul, like comes fully born. I mean, when we're born, we're not fully incarnated, so it takes a lifetime to fully incarnate us and bring, who we really are into the world and bring our wisdom. And so this is something that, when you're young, it's hard to be patient or see this perspective. It kind of comes with age, that it takes a lifetime, and you'll be working on this stuff your whole life. And yet, the more that we can consciously understand and, take the descent and get the help we need and learn the tools, the more beautiful and wondrous and fulfilling the whole journey becomes. So a long time ago, we grew up working alongside the father or the mother in daily ways of living and also in community ceremony. We were in a extended family or even a tribal kind of situation. And culture was passed down, cultural wisdom, the history of the family or the tribe. So in our modern era, we have lost so much to the shallows of life, the distraction, the materialism, the dominance games. And so we end up mostly with self-dissatisfaction, even self-hatred, or, frustration and hatred of, the way the world is around us and controls us and limits us and, in some ways still enslaves us. So we're in this very important time, I think, not only in this year of the Southwest of, exploring, this in the annual cycle of the medicine wheel, uh, in the direction of early fall, but we're, also, I think, here collectively, in the world, in the cycle of, larger movements of transformation and development in the world. And I think, the old ways that have, held us and we've stayed with, for all my lifetime basically, are sort of at the point where they have to transition now. And so, you know, I'm sure that very few of us really want to grow up to be factory workers or grocery stockers or middle managers for someone else's workforce, you know. So sadly today, the search for our authentic self, our soul, and its true expression in the world seems to have to play second, be secondary to survival, to making a living, to paying the bills, and so I think it makes us feel lost in that as well. So everyone grows and we learn, but often, in this kind of stuck place, we're, learning more about resentment and frustration and all of that rather than sort of understanding that all of this is difficult, challenging, but it's here to bring out the best in us. It's here to ignite or activate, our hidden powers. And if we never had challenges or difficulties, we would be content to follow the line of least resistance and we would never discover our gifts or our light. So, we have to kind of find a different understanding of life's, missteps or painful situations or difficulties or, all of this, that there's something else actually going on more than just a kind of outer cause and effect, that leaves us powerless. And, the good news is when we can understand that there is a deeper kind of quantum layer of creating our experience in all of this, it empowers us. And we begin to have new tools and new ways to navigate and find our way, um, through the different things in life. And, some people, like they have a lot of light and they had maybe a less challenging early childhood or, they had some good support. And then others of us, were uh, having very difficult lifetimes early on. And I'm going to talk about this a little more later, but I think that, part of this is also pointing to an aspect of the soul journey and the sensitivity and the traumatization early on in life. I think actually is a part of a type of soul journey where we are, coming in to take on and learn the gifts of healing and to learn, the ways of navigating these traumas and these tragedies and these blocks and these difficulties so that we can supply wisdom for the tribe, so we can help others that may be lost in that same difficulty. And so in tribal-based cultures, really every new child was welcomed into the world as a gift to their people. And early on, the gift was hidden, was welcomed and then cultivated to become its fullest expression. And like I said, a name was given at birth, but the true name would be discovered in the course of the child's growing into its unique nature and its greatest possibilities. So in today's world, it's very different than that. Instead of sort of understanding that each child is unique and has its own journey to make, we feel like we have to make sure that the child conforms to what would be safe, what would allow it to first of all get educated and learn a trade in a field where they would have good material reward so that they can also look good and compete with others who are looking good, right? And so it's again all this outer aspect of the world. And of course, this has gotten even more ubiquitous with social media. And, this is still learning. This can lead to opportunities for expression and maybe finding what's not you and, stumbling or, discovering, somehow that it's not you, and then you go on your search to find the real you. It can lead to all kinds of understanding and learning. At its highest, it can be another form of exploration, right? Just trying on all kinds of possibilities that are within reach and to see if, anything will, sort of sit with us. And sometimes we're unconsciously just seeking attention. But we will discover over time, even if that's what we're doing, and even if it succeeds, that attention is not exactly what we need. It still is not enough, or it still isn't the real thing, or something is missing. So, it's kind of like all of life is teaching us, and it's self-correcting in many, many ways. But if we're very stubborn creatures, and sometimes without a clearer perspective on what's going on, we just stay engaged at the deep level of you know uh, rebellion, of conflict, of negation, for, to preserve ourselves in a way. But this is where there's a better way to preserve ourselves and to bring ourselves fully into the world. So, as each life stage gets extended and drawn out in Western civilization, and often, our answers don't seem to ever be found, and the initiation either doesn't take place or it doesn't take, and the special job or relationship that will finally provide you with your happy place in the world never seems to materialize, or if it does, it's not what we thought. And so we grow older without truly finding our greatest gifts, which the world needs. And when this happens, both our own soul and the world are impoverished. Um, and, you know, it happens. But it's also like there's so many opportunities for us, especially as we take on understanding the larger, journey that we're on and the purpose of it, that can really make a huge difference. And there's at no point are you too old to begin in some way, right? It's like all of this is just waiting for us, moment by moment, to remember ourselves, to jump off a cliff that we've been terrified of for a long time, or many many different ways of sort of looking at this descent to soul. And this I like this term, descent to soul. It was coined by Bill Plotkin, who is the founder of the Animas Valley Institute, which is in Durango, Colorado, and is a beautiful institution for deepening into ecotherapy and reconnecting with nature, and doing these deep initiatory processes. And so I recommend, and he has some books I'll share at the end of the talk here, and hopefully you can explore more. It's a vast and beautiful territory to learn about, and hopefully to internalize and apply in your own lives. So and these kinds of technologies that we're sort of reclaiming and recovering in this modern culture, they really are. You can see how they go back through all cultures and all times, different variations on them, and some of them, maybe sort of extreme, but somehow this thing is necessary for becoming human. And this is something that most of us in our culture had to find on our own, and maybe with limited success. And we look around and all we see is masks, and it's very confusing. So we found that because we're unable to ascend, like a lot of times that's what forces the descent on us, right? It's like we keep kind of trying to make it in this world, trying to do better, trying to work out, figure it out, do the next great thing that will bring us finally into this state of arrival in some way, right? And it doesn't happen. So there's this, I think, way that itself can kind of become the barrier that forces us to turn into the descent. And so some of us found it because we were unable to ascend, and then that just naturally forced this descent. And then often the reason why we aren't is because there was early trauma, or we carried a lot of our, sort of maybe ancestral trauma. And so there's something that the early traumas that we faced indicate in tribal and more, early cultures and these ancient technologies, they would recognize that young people that went early into this descent went through struggles and trauma in their early childhood, and sickness oftentimes was an element. Getting hit by lightning, different things that, like were signs to the people that this soul, had a mission that was, more oriented towards the spirit, towards the healing, towards the, capacity to be the shaman and the spiritual guide in the tribe, and the way to walk between the worlds, and the way to interpret and, be the medium, um, and help the community find their way. So, it's like, again, in our culture, we're more sensitive, we're more traumatized, and it becomes like a sort of a sign, on our skin, somehow inviting torment, inviting, it's like everybody gets provoked by something inside of us that they don't like, and they want to try to suppress it. And they don't want to be forced to feel their own feelings. And, so there's this way that, people in our culture that hold this gift often are belittled, often are, traumatized a lot in childhood. So, it's like if we understood the powers of sensitivity and the special work that the soul that takes that on has to do, in order to balance and accept it, we can understand why this is a soul that has, some weight and some, experience, and, is taking on a big task, a difficult task. But, each soul, every soul journey, we take on the task that we can do. Now it's kind of 50-50. It takes, our total dedication and willingness to bring it over, because we are sort of composed of half light and half darkness. And again, it's which part of us are we going to feed, right? And so this way of, recognizing and then undergoing an initiation, it can be done ceremonially and intentionally, or like I said, for many of us, life does it for us. But if we do not understand what's happening in that initiation, it does, feel very painful, and it can result in getting stuck kind of in the birth canal, in the second birth into our full human capacity. So, it's like this is where having guides, having mentors, having elders, having, these kinds of things recovered, and we are starting to recover them now, but it's, early in what kind of like the full adoption that I think is really needed, and maybe many interesting ways of finding how to do this. But we first have to, recognize that there is a lack here, and what difference it would make. So let me back up to the council wheel, right? Like we talked earlier about it taking 27 years to go around once, and you're considered a human being. And this because there's like these 9 perspectives around the wheel, right? And each one of those you're experiencing like for a period of time that amounts to 4 times 9 moons, or 3 years. And it's like, or in that lodge where you're kind of exploring these themes of that lodge. And as you cycle around the whole wheel, it's like, again, it's an integration and a weaving. And each of the lodges is a kind of an alternately themed movement into, out into individuation, and then back into community, and out into individuation and back into community. And this is kind of the way that nature works, and the way things, like we tend to think of either ors or black or whites, but nature is always like this movement, and this balancing in the movement, right? And I think that that's something that, in our egocentric understanding, it's right or wrong, it's good or bad, there's this duality. And we think we have to stake a space of one and fight against the other. And that actually does create a world of duality. So, in our upcoming lunar eclipse and the movement into sort of the fall, the dark side of the journey, this descent time in the year into fall and winter, as the sun moves further south and the nights get longer, there are many who are saying that this coming lunar eclipse that's happening on, I think, tomorrow night into the early morning hours of tomorrow night, which would actually be the 28th, will launch a collective descent to the soul. So, I'm listening to some of the astrological readings and stuff, and the collective, and, they're saying it's a very interesting lunation and eclipse, and their understanding is that the eclipses are kind of, 6 month forces that kind of propel the evolutionary movements in culture and in nature as well. So, this is a significant one, and it has this potential anyway to sort of be that crisis that forces the descent, right? And in this way, a collective one, because most of the Western world has, not understood this and taken this journey, at least in a way that's, conscious enough to make use of it. And so the aspects for this eclipse seem to suggest that we're getting kind of closer and closer to going off of a cliff, as a collective, and our, maybe it's, our shipping, maybe it's, the bank, the money losing value, I don't know, but there's all of these forces, right, including earth changes and everything. So the pressure has been building, and most of us can feel it, and it is a tipping point at some point, potentially this eclipse, where then we will be forced into this cultural descent to soul. And, the forces um, that are building to a climax and a crisis. And the pathwork also talks about, how there's a spiritual significance to every crisis. That it's basically calling us into a time of collective reckoning and recollection of who we are and where we've come from. Again, the Mediums and Singers Lodge. And from the forces of light and darkness, these poles that are battling within and around us, asking who will we be, what is my place, and how do we build a new world, right? And trusting that the descent is safe, right? That it will have riches. We will maybe discover some bones and things from the past, but we will also discover our inner gold. And it is through sort of dropping into the depth of our own being that everything that the world needs will come. And so each one of us is so important and such a part of something way bigger than we are, and we don't realize it. And of course, in the old collective situation, it was still serving us, but it was serving other things. And so it's time for this reawakening and stepping into our own true nature and letting go of these forces of control and government and uh, people that seem to own all of the resources and that kind of thing, right? Somehow I think this time will thwart some of their plans. If it does, it will impact us, right? But that's where, if we recognize again, sort of the divinity in the descent, that there's something trying to happen that is for us and not just against us, challenges that can call forth inner resilience, call forth new creativity, call forth whole new niches and fields of endeavors and communities to establish new forms in. So I think the easiest way too that we can find, so we just don't recreate more of the old world, which is what we've done in times past, with collapses of civilizations and things like that, it's just kind of reinstalled another version of the same thing. Now maybe the, guys on the bottom are on the top or whatever, but it's kind of the same story. So I'm hoping that in this time we are actually looking to uh, go beyond again this polarity and find a way into the future that again looks at the past but does not bring the past into the present and stays in the present, connected to guidance, connected to nature, connected to the world as it is, moment to moment, knowing our place, knowing what calls us, knowing our gift and where it's needed, learning the discernment to know, that, because sometimes people can want our gifts and maybe it's not for us to give or somebody else or another way that that person needs to arrive there. So we have to kind of like learn to hold a space of love, without listening to exactly, what they want, what, you know, the books tell us we should do, anything like that, and tune into our own inner center and feel within our guidance as best we know. And then if it's inaccurate, if it's, something where uh, it really isn't the highest, or we're somehow unconsciously hooked into some of our own um, self duplicity, then we will discover that it will come into the light, and so we can trust life to educate us, to show us the way, and all we have to do is learn to just simply be here and not be needing our defense and not needing to control everything completely. Um, and all of us struggle with this, there in different ways and different things. Some of the things I've learned to let go of control in my ADHD, is like it's been beneficial, and there are other things that, it's much harder for me, and I know I still, have to learn a deeper level of surrender and faith and allowing things to um, show themselves, and find their way in a sense, and by me holding the space for that to happen, that we I think will actually come together, with each other, you know, and so I'm speaking also, to all of the people that we care for, our loved ones, our friends, and there's so often this way that we feel like we want them to be a certain way with us, and we want to uh, control them, and so it's to take responsibility for some of that level, and it often feels like we're discerning and we're in the correct, we understand what the problem is and they should change or whatever, but uh, we're all sort of, I think, learning to look at this at a different level and to see, what is going on here that could transform in a different way. This is one of those dynamics that we get lost in a lot. And so it's kind of a study on my blackboard, it's kind of a puzzle that I'm working with in my own life. And, each one has a little bit of a unique, aspect of this, but I think, usually there's some main issue that seems like other people, are creating. and and we don't seem to be in control, and so it feels like, well, what should we do? Should we let go, or should we keep fighting, or should we you know uh, give up, and or like, so we try to give up and that feels crappy, and so we go back to fighting, and then that doesn't feel right, and then and so we go back and forth, and this is a part of this huge deep study in the underworld, in the descent, around acceptance and surrender, and letting go, and understanding where it's ours to uh, sort of hold and stand in and take on and bear, and where It's really not. And there's a kind of codependency, or there's a kind of forcing current in our energy that is contributing and creating, co-creating the impasse. So I wasn't thinking I was going to ramble off into that one, but anyway, let's back up a little bit and talk about how, so awakening to uh, this understanding of seeking, what is my place, how do I build a new world, uh, that we need understanding and clarity about who we choose to be. That's one step, but we cannot do it really without help, without elders, and also the friendships of our friends, but also all nature beings, all spiritual beings, that make up this world. And so there's really a way that our culture is in this deep state of separation that puts them asleep. So they dream only of themselves as if they exist independently. And this is really a mad illusion that most of us have inside, because we've been tragically separated from our belongingness and interconnectedness and embeddedness with everything, including the help and the guidance of our elders and our ancestors and our plant cesters and the living world of intelligence and spirit all around us. And when we've lost all of that, we feel very alone, in thinking that, in a way, as a human even, we're the only beings in the universe that are intelligent and self-aware. And then most other human beings don't get us, right? So we're alone. And so nature is really a whole different story and can speak to us. um, our life story can speak to us. Our true self can speak to us. And when we are humble and listening, other people are drawn to us. So, and there's many ways that, our culture has lost this ability, because we don't see, intelligence in all being, plants, rocks, lakes, rivers, clouds, sun, moon, stars, all of these things in an animistic world, are not objects. They're not just material objects. They are intelligence, conscious, they are beings. And so, when we live in this animated world of all of these beings, and we have our imagination open and attuned, we begin to actually, allow and speak and receive understanding, guidance, support. And most people know, like going into the forest, and along a stream side or something, that they immediately feel better, right? Or something calls and supports them. So, you know, eh, we have this sort of subtle intuition that I just want to invite everybody to pay attention to. Like, trust that it's not just something happening inside of you because your chemicals are changing because the forest helps you. I mean, that could be some of it too. But it's also, I think, really useful to think of, the spirit of the forest, some aspect of the forest, maybe the water, flowing waters themselves, but, whatever, something is, present with you and soothing you, is calming you, is cleansing you, is uplifting you, like often the breeze feels like it enlightens, uplifts. uh, the shine of the sun through the forest, illuminating, right? There's all kinds of ways that, um, if we personify nature and treat it, as a relative, as a living being in all of its many forms, then, we have a much, much richer life experience. And, in some ways, I think I may have mentioned this before, but, it's like allowing life to be, an aspect of the divine. So, we have the first person, second person, and third person experience of the divine. The first person is the divine within us. The second person is that I thou relationship, maybe with, the what we call God, or some kind of sense of father, mother, that can come to our aid, can protect, can help us, angelic beings, guardian angels, right? And then there is this third person, God, or third person divine, which is the flow of time in nature through the world. And so all of this is like a tapestry that's being woven. And when the bird sings, when you're sitting in the chair beneath the tree, yeah, it's probably calling to mark its territory, or say hi to somebody. But it's like, how does that feel inside of you? Does it touch you? Does it resonate something? Do you feel connected? Because I believe that it's kind of working on all levels and layers. Again, the individual bird has its individual journey, but it's more than that, right? There's depth in all of it. There's life and story, and personal connection, embeddedness, true love. I mean, if you ever feel the energy of the forest, I think that's the closest thing we can know to really feeling love, right? And so this harmonizing, right? And this connectedness, and this embracing of everything. So when we are humble and listening, nature can speak to us, and so can many other things. And so we need to feel this embeddedness within the whole, and we need to remember sort of the true cosmic, mythic, energetic, imaginal, emotional nature of the world, right? We are all these things. And, it seems like we're very limited in what's accepted and allowed in our worlds. No less than all of this, we have to have all of that. Anything less, we may not find our way forward. And this is reclaiming all of who we are, and finding our way forward. And that way, is ultimately in the collective, but it's in the collective through each one of us, and through what we choose to invest in, and what we choose to give the best we have to. And so part of the journey is to find, our niche. Where is that place? What is that, gift that compels us to give, that makes us happy in service, right? Uh, and it also means that, we have to kind of let go of trying to serve everything else and everyone else. So that helps in a lot of ways, because we understand, like, I can let go of having to take care of, respond to, you know, uh, everything there. Maybe I have to comply to a certain degree, or whatever, but it's not, like my main task in the world. So, we can then focus more and more fully. And the more that I think we recognize and choose it, the more also life will support that. And we can seek the help also. So the world has a challenging and pitiless face sometimes. But in my experience, I see it as my interpretation, usually when something is happening that, is not what I wanted, or maybe I don't understand it. And then almost all other times, I realize that the world that I'm experiencing is amazing, is happening for me, is loving and playful and incredibly intelligent, and an amazing guide who always knows better than myself, what I'm working on and what I need. So, it's this kind of relaxed place where I used to have a million faults that I felt like, well, if only I fixed that, or if only I got better at that, or only if I was this way or that way. I'd finally be there, right? And I couldn't even figure out what the priority was. They all seemed to be needed to be done at once, and that was not possible. So I really like, seeing this world as a guide, right? Life as a guide, and it shows you exactly where your work is, and if it's taking you into a big or a mini descent, right? It's like, if we don't resist that, if we understand that it's a guide and a teacher, then we're more willing and interested in following, and the self-discovery that comes out of that, and it unravels things and smooths the way and makes light of the life, right? So as humans, we sort of naturally want to take the path of least resistance. And I can find a part of me that actually feels entitled to it, gets very upset when something difficult shows up. So in hindsight, I can always see the point, once I get past that moment, but oftentimes in the moment, it seems like, the why that the world took the turn it did, the value of the side trip, so to speak, is not always immediately obvious and seems like a problem and inconvenience, something that I didn't want. So, it's like, as I pay attention to this kind of disharmony in me, this kind of resistance, and realize that, like, ultimately the world is what it is, right? What's happening is what is. I can't, like I can rebel against that, but that, uh, doesn't will just put me in rebellion. It doesn't really resolve anything, right? And that the movement happens more when I can accept and be with and allow what is to be there, and then in that allowing, some kind of grace and movement happens that often gives perspective or brings it into the light, has a different understanding come, more easily than if I'm just, kind of stuck in my positionality and, fighting, resisting, rebelling against it in some way. So again, like, some areas it's easy to do this, in some areas it's not. And so the guide in the pathwork says that, we have many aspects of our soul at different levels of development. And so we just have to, begin to understand that who we are is like in the center of that medicine wheel. We are our essence. And then we have, like, all of these perspectives and all of these experiences and all of these parts of us that had these experiences circling the medicine wheel. And our job is integrating. Our job is going through and being with and learning to accept and allow the movement through of everything that, we've encountered and that ultimately we will encounter. So at the soul level, the world really is a conspiracy for our benefit. The human personality doesn't often experience that, but it's a blessing if we can. And to know that is to begin to connect with one's soul, to be, like, experiencing oneself at this level of, why is my life unfolding in this way, and what does it have to reflect back to me? It's in some ways like looking at our life like we would look at our dreams. They're symbolic. They're showing us. They're revealing parts of the unconscious that we don't see easily, and so, we can just kind of keep being humble and curious and interested and trusting that, it's all happening to guide us, to show us the way, to help us find our way, into a more full and uplifted life. And so then there is this, larger aspect of ourselves that, is always with us and connected to, also many other guides and divine beings that we've basically been taught to ignore. Like anything, again, that's not material doesn't exist. But I think there's a large number of people in the world that kind of question that assumption from their own inner experience, right? So in the pathwork, the guide says that we create our own reality, period. And I actually first ran into this thought when I found a book called Seth Speaks by Jane Roberts in the very early 70s. It sort of fell off the shelf into my hand at a time of, spiritual need. And, it made sense to me, but I couldn't quite understand it. And so that kind of began my journey to find the pathwork, because the pathwork finally sort of really helped me realize, how do we create our own reality? And, of course, I'm not saying that the ego creates and chooses the difficulties and the challenges. If it does so, it does it unconsciously, right? And so there's often times, ways that we don't understand sort of the basic spiritual laws. And so, we are manifesting through the ego unconsciously things that we don't want. So it's good, again, to understand and learn more on that. But there's also this deeper part of you that, kind of according to the pathwork, chose, the main themes and the main events of life. And, there's not that there isn't free will and choice involved, but that these were, chosen, maybe the family we were born into and the time and the culture, and, all of these things were, nuanced in a way that, we were trying to go into, through, and out the other side of a kind of confusion, maybe, that we hadn't worked through, hadn't integrated completely from other lifetimes, that kind of thing. And so, the part of us that's the soul is one level of this self-creation. And then there's, the personality, and there's a part of us that might be stressed by much of the way things are, and it seems powerless in the face of it. And there's a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of feeling about the choices, even. So, it's not like you even get to choose what you really want. You got to choose between the worst of two things you don't want. And so this is, like what happens in duality. And the ego finds itself in this kind of state a lot. And so there is this deep healing also of this confusion inside of us. And nature, I find, is a beautiful guide for that as well, because there is polarity in nature, right? Night and day, hot and cold, life and death. But those are not dualities. It's not hot versus cold, life versus death. These are part of this ongoing Tao of life, right? The flow of energy. And so, the part of us that does feel sort of stuck in these places, and doesn't realize that there's something underneath, but we sense there must be something underneath this madness, right? It's like when we're lost in our patterns and sort of like, oh, this seems so familiar, like been here, done this, in different place, different time. Groundhog's Day, I don't know, it's kind of like there's this sometimes quality to life where we're recognizing it. And, we do sense that there's got to be a point or some purpose behind this that we just don't quite understand. And I think that's a good direction to go in, like everything that is of difficulty is a new place we can learn something more about, how to make it easier, how to be freer, how to, be with it. But, again, in the surrender, it doesn't become the same thing as it was in the state of resistance. So, there's just a journey that we're on. And this sense of something else happening, if we pay attention to it, instead of just, trying to ignore it and, address it at the level of sort of the everyday experience. it is a clue. The greater self has given us this puzzle on the blackboard, this, seemingly impossible, you know, frustrating, damned if I do, damned if I don't thing, for a purpose. The greater self, both the higher self and the shadow, are at work within this, actually. And the duality that we're trapped in, is ultimately an illusion. So when we manifest it in the world, it's what our soul is doing is it's the puzzle that we're given by the soul, and then if we accept the assignment, we can really explore it, and we can make something amazing happen. Steps towards much greater happiness and fulfillment in big and small ways. So it's true that the ego, the personality, didn't choose this difficulty, this challenge, this and it seems a lot. It seems like it's a great toll and difficulty. But I think this is also a part of, like our wounds, our difficulties, like they have to be worthy and equal to our light in a way, right? Again, as creatures of least resistance, if we're not given a really strong, difficult puzzle, right? Um, we won't get the point. We won't, we'll solve it too easily. We won't learn in the process, and we won't develop maybe the compassion in the awareness of, life's challenges, that we can see happen to us, but also to our brothers and sisters, the people we love, as well as, you know, all of the life on the planet. So basically, wherever we go, there we are, and the only way out is through. And the truth is, we always have the right to say no. It's part of our free will, and it's always a good choice if that's what we feel, right? It's not so good to override and be in pretense or not non-authentic with what we're feeling. And usually if we're in a no, it's saying that some part of us is not ready. And so it really wouldn't be good for us, to force and in a way the no is the authentic choice and the correct one. Even if it causes us to still remain trapped in the stuck place. It's okay, because by recognizing and staying there, and honoring the truth of that will allow us to find the way beyond. If we don't fight it but explore it, eventually we will find the inner freedom to say yes and begin the transformation. And we have many facets, and some are, like I said, more transformed than others. And at some point, like this descent to soul, will begin for all of us, and maybe it'll be a long journey, or maybe a series of short, brief ones, or whatever. It doesn't have any particular, like only one way of doing it, right? Life will find a way to take us there because life needs us to go there so we can grow. When we resist too long, we will create crisis. And the guide defines crisis as, a block where the power of the life force is, moving, and the block is holding against that, and the guide says the life force is going to be more powerful. If we can consciously recognize and let go of the block, we don't create crisis. We'll create choice and create, new movement. But where we can't, remove the block, and it is time, life says, like we can't wait. It will, move forward and kind of upend things and create some crisis, or some, circumstance will befall that, will shake things up, because that's kind of how crisis works. It shakes things up, and then we have an opportunity, no guarantee, but an opportunity to reevaluate from a little different perspective, from a different circumstance. So we're always we're working and moving through the journey of the soul. And when we can understand and not fight the descents, when we can trust the process, it becomes an interesting journey. It becomes an adventure, a mystery, you know, sometimes, scary, sometimes, very real, but, it also takes on a numinous quality, which then can, make us feel like we have, a deservingness in our being to be supported and to be guided. And when we feel deserving, our, connection with our guides, our embeddedness in the world, all of this returns to us. It's largely created by our separation within ourself from ourself, from our own unique goodness. So, we're just learning to come back to all of that. And I think right now, in a way, the world can't wait for us much longer. We really need to return to our animistic understanding of the journey and of the place of Mother Nature, of the world that we find ourselves in. I think the question that we always need to ask ourselves is, is it life-giving? So many stories and worldviews are not life-giving. They may feel logical, they may feel familiar, they may feel real, but if they're not life-giving, I think that they're not the ultimate truth. They belong to the ego world of duality. They belong to the win-lose, right, wrong, okay, not okay, top, bottom, pleasure, pain, life, death. And this is the world of illusion, and we'll never really find happiness there. Nature is not in duality. Like I said before, she does have polarity, but that is what makes the circuit and allows the energy to flow. That's the Tao, the balance and the ever-moving transitions from dark to light, summer to winter, pleasure to pain, or pain to pleasure. All things are embraced and included, and all things are moving, and nothing gets stuck or stays, but it keeps balancing. Nothing is gotten rid of. It's, again, balanced, held in balance. So I hope that we can go into this more animistic view of nature. And it's interesting because I think science is actually, and there's just different ways that it's calling to us in many forms right now. I think it's coming alive again within the collective consciousness, and so highly recommended. And this was, originally rejected with the new system of science that required objectivity, so that we didn't like assume or project our own natures onto nature. Now, this seems rational, and we do know that the mind does project. But I think the attempt is a little bit unrealistic, and then it also throws the baby out with the bath. I think if we can realize and hold our projections lightly, and we can use our imagination, and we can use all our senses and all of our faculties to understand, including science, but that this does not have to be such an exclusionary and definitive thing. Eckhart Tolle says it this way, he says, when we observe nature from the mind, a tree becomes board feet of lumber, the bird becomes a research project, the mountain becomes something we mine or climb. So everything is just material and transactional, and so conveniently, all of this matter doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what we do to it, right? How we're in relationship to it. It's just stuff. It has no rights or essence of itself. People own it, it's property. It has no sentience, no interior existence of its own. This is the fundamental lie. And this approach has created, in a way, an abundant material world, but it's inherently unequal and more is dispossessed, damaged, and a lot of compromise physically. The whole world system, right, is sick, has a fever, is imbalanced in so many ways. And in some places in the world, nature is being given legal status that actually grants the legal right for aspects of nature like a river or mountain, to exist and interact with its vast network of systems that give rise to it, and have the right, legally in human courts to, preserve its essence, its integrity. And so, the fact is, this is, sort of not an obvious law that we should all have everywhere. It kind of points to how lost we are. So to original peoples worldwide, animism was the way they understood and interacted with their world, and everything in the world was a relationship. And all my relations was a phrase that spoke to the simple reality of the kinship of all life. The felt connection, the embeddedness. The underlying wisdom was that we all need each other, and every one of us, to be all that we can be, both on the individual and the collective level. We are never alone, and we are never separate. Nature doesn't reject. She allows everything to be as it is, and then she balances and transforms. So how can each of us regain our own animistic experience of the world? You had it as a child. You remember that even, the teddy bear seemed real and had feelings. Ask yourself, was this just purely imagination? In our adult world, we do believe that, right? It was just silly, our own projection. But if you feel more deeply into your interior being and tune into the essence of that teddy bear, the essence of that relationship that you had with it, you may discover something else there. The depression I experienced when I started to learn about the mechanics, as a child, all of these mechanics of nature devoid of the essence, the sentience and the self-awareness of everything. Yeah, I felt, sad. I was in grief, and it turned into a kind of depression and a struggle with a separation from something that, was taken from me. So, in a way, from all children. And if we return to this living world all around us, that's when we're going to find the elders we need. We'll find them in the trees and the lakes and the mountaintops, and we'll find the guides and the ancient wisdom that still live within us. And if we ask, if we seek, we will be answered. And the future, I believe, will be a radiant time of relationship restored within everything. And we will never feel alone. And we will love each other again. And we will love the beauty of life and each aspect of life in a way that celebrates and receives, joy, beauty, goodness. So I think this is our close for today. We've gone a bit over, and so I just want to share with you a little. I don't know if this will reverse the... Yeah, it doesn't. So there's Nature and the Human Soul is one of the books of Bill Plotkin, which is really an interesting, way of looking at a soul-centric development of the human being. using this medicine wheel that it's a little different than the one that I showed you, but as another, really useful developmental medicine wheel. One of his first books is called Soulcraft, Crossing into the Mysteries of Nature and Psyche. And then I think he has a new one that is about the descent to soul and this work of initiation. So highly recommended. And if you want to do any of this experience, on a little smaller scale than going all the way out to California, or if you want to just dip your toe in, I think it can be done that way as well. And the retreat here has many options. I'm happy to do a little consultation on Zoom to explore what might be done. Just if your local ongoing connection and time in nature and spent with intention at this level, is also a great way of reigniting all of these levels of our own connection with all of being, all of life. Okay, thanks everybody. See you in 2 weeks.